Alright, guys, so today we're going to talk about America's big pivot to Russia and why it's happening. So, the US has suddenly done a 180 and it seems that they are cozying it up with Russia. And why is this happening? We have seen many shocking things in the past few weeks that have horrified Europe. Now, we have Trump asking NATO to increase their war budget all the way to 5%, and then hitting the EU with brutal tariffs that we are going to cover tonight as well. Let's not forget JD Vance went all the way to Munich scolding the EU and Germany, especially Germany, for not having a defense industry. What else have we seen? The US holding peace talks with Lavrov in Saudi Arabia without the Europeans. And the US most famously or notoriously, depends on how you see it, opposed the UN resolution to condemn Russia's aggression. Which means all the neocons we are seeing, like John Bolton and even Bernie Sanders, they're losing their minds and they're scolding Trump. And in his latest meeting with Keir Starmer, he actually said that no, Ukraine is not going to join NATO. It's not going to happen. And that really shocked Keir Starmer all the way to his bones.
Europeans want Ukraine to be part of NATO as part of this deal. Are you willing to budge on that at all, or is it a firm?
Well, I could be very nice and say, oh, well, we'll work to it. Look, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. That's what started this whole thing. Biden said that, and all of a sudden the gun started. That was one of the primary reasons it started. And this was long before President Putin. They never said it was an impossibility. So we can say, oh, gee, well, we'll try. But that's something that's just not going to happen. And then the other question you ask is about the land. Will you get your land back? Well, they've fought long and hard on the land, and you and I will be discussing that. And we're going to certainly try and get as much as we can back. But on the NATO, it's just not, that's not going to happen. Yeah.
Now we have to understand where this is truly coming from. Why is Trump actually doing this? And the best way to look through is an economic lens, because it will explain everything here. So the US and Russia, they're going to meet again in Turkey, and Ukraine is not on the agenda. I don't really think they're going to talk much about the war. They're going to talk about the economic prospects of Russia and the US working together. And everyone needs to see what this really is. Trump wants to end the Ukraine war, not really to save the region, but to save the US economy. They've already spent a ton of money, a ton of treasure, and a ton of debt to help Ukraine. And well, we all saw what Biden did over the last 2 to 3 years, right? And this is the situation we are here today. The Russians are not losing. Now, Trump said that the amount totals to around $300 billion. The Department of Defense puts it at less than $200 billion, but suffice to say, it's still an enormous amount of money. Inflation is very high in the US. Consumer expectations put inflation at around 5 to 6% going forward. So this is really, really very risky. And long-term bond yields, they are high as well, and they must not go above the psychological 5% mark, or there will be disasters in the markets. Just look back what happened over the past 24 hours. Almost $1 trillion worth of market cap was wiped out of the S&P, especially US big tech, right? Just look at the entire environment. The US is now facing a very innovative and economically strong China. Can they afford to decouple with Russia right now? Which brings us back to the big geopolitical and economic confrontation with China. The US wants to make an ambitious pivot to take on Chinese industries. And that's why we've seen this big tariff war, this big tariff backlash across every single country out there, on Mexico, on Canada, of course on China as well, and the reciprocal tariff that's going to hit every country in the world. Now, Trump has just announced that the tariffs are going to escalate, so all of us might be on a hook. Everyone from Asia to Saudi Arabia to Singapore to Australia, every country is now, they're lined up in front of the firing squad. So for Trump to really confront China when it comes to industries, all his ducks must be lined up. Firstly, you need to stop excessive spending as wastage so as to drop the deficit and suppress bond yields as much as you can. And that's why we are seeing Elon Musk go around firing people, trying to tell people to write him an email, what have you done over the last week? It sounds ridiculous, but it's just the administration finding ways and means to slash people off the payroll. And more importantly, you also need access to critical minerals and resources, the inputs needed for industry themselves. Now, Russia truly understands this, and that's why they're dangling the ultimate carrot in front of the United States. The US is already facing higher energy prices. Trump went all the way to Davos and told Saudi Arabia, he told OPEC, can you guys please pump more oil to increase production and to bring prices down? But OPEC isn't cooperating. They have their own agenda and they want oil prices to stay high. So that's bad for US inflation. That's why we have the Kremlin telling the US Russia is filled with rare earths metals that the US needs. Russia is open to developing rare earth projects with the US and most likely on the occupied Ukrainian territories. There's a lot of speculation that more than 40 to even 70% of all the rare earths, the $1 trillion declared rare earths, are within the Russian controlled oblasts, that territory over there. Now, Russia is keen for this to happen because it gives them two extremely big advantages, and we cannot overstate it, we cannot underplay it. Firstly, it firms up the peace treaty and gets the EU out of their bags. Because for the longest time, over the last 5, 10, or even 20 years, even though Russia did supply the US with some commodities, Russia did supply the US with oil, the business dealings weren't as deep as how it could be in the future years and the future decades ahead, right? It finally will allow the EU to get off their backs. Finally, Russia will have some direct business ties with the US. You just imagine this. You have the US and Russia, all of them are developing new mines, developing new rare earth mines together. Obviously, the US will want to protect their economic interests over there. So the peace treaty, if it gets signed, which I assume that it will be enforced by United States because they now have a concrete economic financial stake there. They have a critical mineral supplier that's providing them with much needed manufacturing inputs, and rare earths are extremely important here. You need them for EVs, you need them for semiconductors, and you also need them for certain defense applications as well. And this is what the US desperately needs. Secondly, Russia has a guaranteed buyer that is desperate to pay more. Simply put, the US is extremely dependent on China for critical mineral imports, from graphite to antimony to germanium and gallium. For many of these categories, we are seeing 50% dependency. The US really can't afford that. Trump wants to break away from this. And until they do, China can always twist the screws when it comes to export bans. If you want to tariff us, we'll just make your inputs cost even more higher, and that's going to break your industries, that's going to break your supply chains, and you won't be able to export your goods at a very competitive rate. Yes, you might get more US market share, push us out, but your global exports will not be competitive. It's important to note that Rubio has confirmed Trump's true agenda for peace as well, is to break up the alliance of Russia and China, to buy off Russian resources so as to divert cheap commodities away from Beijing to isolate China's economy. We can already see this in the oil markets, right? China, over the last 2 to 3 years at least, have been buying a lot of discounted Russian oil.
We're seeing the Russians and the Chinese, working more and more closely together these days. Is the hope here almost kind of an inverse of that strategy here of, a Trump goes to Russia type thing, or very similar to like Nixon goes to China?
I don't know if we'll ever be successful at peeling them completely off a relationship with the Chinese. I don't think having China and Russia at each other's neck is also good for global stability, because they're both nuclear powers. And if Russia becomes a permanent junior partner to China in the long term, well, now you're talking about two nuclear powers aligned against the United States. And even 10 years from now, 5 years from now, if this trend continues, we could find ourselves in a situation where whether Russia wants to improve its relations with the U.S. or not, they can't, because they become completely dependent on the Chinese because we've cut them off. I think having a situation where the Russians are permanently a junior partner to China, having to do whatever China says they need to do because of their dependence on them, I don't think that's a good outcome for Russia, and it's not a good outcome for America or for Europe or for the world.
And in his own words, Rubio doesn't want Russia to be China's junior partner. But he's forgetting what really pushed China and Russia together in the first place: Western hubris and EU common values, right? Russia will continue to face pressure from the EU, including sanctions and perhaps even military pressure in the future. That much is baked into the cake. Just look at the stubbornness of the EU politicians and those in the UK as well. And this is especially true if the EU continues to build up their military industries. It's important to recognize geography as well here. China is just next to Russia, and a lot of infrastructure is connected, especially all the oil, all the gas pipelines as well, all the shipping lanes. A ton of deals they have been signed, and China has had Russia's back over the sanctions. So there's a very big element of loyalty here. So will Russia and China break away their alliance? Will it happen? I don't think so. They have their own BRICS agenda and they have very deep mutual understanding with each other. Now, Putin and Xi has made it clear that Russia and China relations cannot be moved apart. And once again, this is a no limits partnership. It's really important to understand that the Trump administration won't last forever. It's not like Donald Trump's going to be the president for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And even if JD Vance becomes the new president 4 years later, how long is he going to last as well? The future is highly uncertain, especially with the EU not wanting to play ball. Most recently, we saw the new German elections with Merz becoming the new Chancellor of Germany or about to ascend to become the new Chancellor. And he said in his speech, in his acceptance speech or victory speech, that he wants to break away from US independence. Now, I find that quite hard to believe in the short term, but you can see the desire from the Europeans to break away, which means even if the US and Russia has a peace treaty of sorts, the EU has their own agenda to maybe, push some of their own end goals on the entire situation. Now, another reason is BRICS as well. Now, this bloc will be the fastest growing economic bloc compared to the G7. At the most, the G7 is only going to grow between 1 to 2.5% GDP. However, the BRICS are going to grow at 4, 5, or even 6% for some countries like India. Russia also cannot ignore China's growing potential to be number one and their technological leap. It's going to be impossible for the US to ever grant Russia the highest technology chips as well. There's still a lot of deep mistrust, especially in the US deep state since the Soviet days. That is not going to go away suddenly. China's also very deep in Russia's economy and they export deflation to Russia through cheap goods when inflation is actually soaring in Moscow. So it's another big consideration we have to understand as well. Russia-China trade is extremely de-dollarized, so there is no threat of Western sanctions, and worse comes to worse, Putin can always pay in the ruble, the local currency. So if you're asking me, or if you think that America coming in to develop certain projects when Russia is going to push China out, I don't really think so. For the Chinese, it's going to be just business as usual for them, right? And it might even benefit them. There's less tensions between the Americans and Russians. It all comes down to how Putin is going to play his card as well. Now, what's shocking is how China also supports Russia's collaboration with the US to end the war. So this is truly coming from a place of confidence and not terror. China truly has nothing to fear. They are in a strong position both financially, in their military as well. And to freak out now is just to lose their advantage and waste resources on non-urgent things. China's number one priority now is to sanction-proof and tariff-proof their own economy. They have to boost domestic demand. And once they manage to do that, they will control the world's factory and the biggest marketplace in the globe for everything, right? And it goes beyond cars. It goes into consumer goods as well. And that's going to be the pinnacle that allows them to supersede the United States. There's really nothing to be afraid of here. And in the grand scheme of things, China is actually on the economic offense. They are playing to win. But the US is on the defense. They are playing not to lose. Very big difference here.